This month, Earth has hit its hottest days recorded in history.
And our team coverage of the extreme heat continues now. Nearly 100 million Americans from coast to coast are under excessive heat warnings and advisories.
The scorching sun and stifling humidity are pushing real field conditions into the triple digits.
The extreme weather is not just impacting the U.S. Parts of Europe are also experiencing dangerously high temperatures and the threat of wildfires.
Worldwide, scientists say about 3.6 billion people have endured temperatures lately that would have been rare in a world without fossil fuels and other human activities.
It's fair to say at this point that most of the U.S. has experienced the effects of climate change. We're seeing temperature records being broken, especially on the West Coast.
Anna Phillips is a climate reporter for The Post.
There were a number of deaths reported that authorities suspect at this point are linked to the heat.
Anna has been reporting on who is most vulnerable to the heat here in the U.S., particularly people working, whether their jobs are indoors or outdoors.
Right now, workers can ask for water, be provided by their employers, but there are really no other restrictions in place or requirements in place that require employers to, let's say, air condition a workplace or to provide shade for people who are outside for hours a day.
But earlier this month, the Biden administration proposed a rule that, for the first time, would protect workers from extreme temperatures.
This is so important because we know that already workers are exposed to extreme and intensifying heat, and that it is making them sick, and it is contributing to deaths.
Not everyone backs the new rules, though, including some of the workers' own employers. From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Monday, July 29th. Today, we hear from Anna on what it means to work in this heat and the push to protect the people who are most vulnerable to the high temperatures. Anna spoke to my co-host, Elahe Izadi. I'll let Elahe take it from here.
So, Anna, if we were just to look at the country and think about extreme heat, who are some of the most vulnerable populations to extreme heat?
Yeah, no question that the workers who are most in danger here are construction workers and farm workers. That's where we have some of the best information about who's most at risk. In the U.S., that tends to be a lot of Latino workers, many of them undocumented. And because of that, workplace safety advocates will say they are less likely to make complaints or to advocate for themselves if employers are exposing them to conditions that are unsafe. There are many other jobs that are also at play here. There have definitely been a lot of high-profile reports over the last couple of years of delivery workers getting sick.
An autopsy will determine if the summer heat indeed played a role in the death of a North Texas UPS worker.
Yeah, this death is reigniting calls from workers for better conditions on routes.
There are a range of jobs that are at where people are at risk here. Some of them are even indoors. Think about, parts of inland California that are high desert, that are very hot. Even if they are ostensibly temperature controlled, the temperature can get very high in these places and people are moving. There's a lot of physical labor involved. And so those workers have talked about suffering from heat illness.
Wow. So it's not just people who are working outside, like I think of field workers or even, people working to construct roads, but even people indoors could be vulnerable to heat.
Yeah, absolutely. We see more deaths from outdoor workers, from agricultural workers and construction workers. That is absolutely the population that's at most risk here. Think of jobs also where maybe the machinery that you're using for your job is putting you at additional risk. It could be an industrial laundry where the people are ironing and they're working with, dryers that are generating a lot of heat, or in foraging. Yeah.
Or I worked at a dry cleaners in high school and we didn't have air conditioning. I remember we had a heat wave, 100-degree weather. I mean, it was just unbearable in there.
Yeah. Think about those types of environments, or kitchens. Often, even if a kitchen is air conditioned, if you're over a stove that's generating a lot of heat, doesn't really matter. It's hot in there.
Yeah. Anna, have you or any of your colleagues spoken to people who have had to work in these sorts of extreme heat conditions? And what did they say about what that has been like for them?
My colleague Nico Rivero interviewed Veronica Carrasco, a 40-year-old construction worker in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and she described what it's like for her to work outside.
Imagínese una temperatura de 110 grados.
She said, you have to imagine it's 110 degrees and I'm on a 40-foot ladder. She said it's like having a fever throughout her entire body.
Es como que tenga fiebre, es como que esté trabajando con fiebre sobre mi cabeza y todo mi cuerpo.
Carrasco knows that she doesn't have many choices here, that she has to work through the heat. There are really no protections in place for her, but she's aware that she can ask for water. She knows that she can advocate for herself. And she's talked about how important that is because she doesn't have other family in the U.S. Her husband died, and she has 3 kids to take care of. And she told us, at the end of the day, she has to make it back home to those kids.
Pero yo necesito llevar a mi casa alimento porque soy mamá sola.
Wow, it does sound like such a tough situation where she feels like she has to take risks and work in such hot conditions. I'm wondering, how does anyone know if they are overheated while they're working? Like, what exactly are the signs of heat illness? What does it look like?
It can be tricky because heat illness can appear like a lot of different symptoms that we might associate with other conditions. So typically it's going to start with heavy sweating, feeling exhaustion, maybe a headache, dehydration. Where it starts to move into a more serious place is when people start to become confused or lose their balance. Their heart might race. They could attribute these symptoms to other health conditions they might already have, which is why some people tend to dismiss the symptoms if they're not educated about what to look for. And, that's really the moment at which they need an intervention. But they're often least able to do it in that moment because the heat is scrambling your brain. So it's making it harder for you to realize that you're in trouble.
So what can workers do to try to keep themselves safe now if they're working in really hot temperatures?
Well, there are steps you can take before you even start working. The first one is just to drink a lot of water. People who work in high temperatures say they typically start drinking a lot of water the night before they even go to work the next day. Paying attention to what you're wearing clothes that breathe, that are light colors that will reflect sunlight, having sun protection, a good hat. Beyond that, really paying attention to what your body is telling you. If you are feeling a little faint, if you're getting a headache, I think a lot of people think, well, I have always gardened in the heat or worked in the heat or whatever activity they're doing, I can handle it. But recognizing that as you get older, you can handle much less and that the heat is getting worse. And so you need to take a break in those circumstances.
I wonder what we can know about how many people have died this year that we can attribute to heat. Because as you mentioned, sometimes heat illness or the extreme heat might exacerbate an underlying condition. What is the best data that we have about heat-related deaths this year?
So we don't have data on heat-related deaths this year. The data definitely lags, which is part of the problem, right? We don't know that we're in a crisis while it's actually happening. So what we can say is that the trends broadly across the country show that heat-related deaths are increasing. The data from the CDC shows that an estimated 2,300 people died from heat-related illnesses last year. That was an increase from the year before and from 2021 as well. But like I said, most health and safety experts would say that's a massive undercount.
I see. And so these are people in general who are estimated to have died from heat-related illness. But as you said, the best thinking is that is a huge undercount.
Yeah, exactly. And it's tough because somebody might experience heat illness at work and then go home to an environment that's not air conditioned, for instance, their body can't cool down and they wind up dying at home. Well, maybe that death ends up being classified as a heat-related death, but it's in the home. It's not necessarily tied back to where it all started at work.
Mm-hmm. Anna, what has the status quo been like up until now for workers in extreme heat? I mean, is it illegal for them to be working in these kinds of conditions? What are employers mandated to do?
It's absolutely legal for people to work in extreme heat. Employers are currently required to provide water, but there are not set conditions under which you can say, when it reaches this temperature, you have to provide rest breaks or any other kinds of interventions. There are really no other restrictions in place or requirements in place that require employers to, let's say, air condition a workplace or to provide shade for people who are outside for hours a day. It's left to employers right now to make common sense decisions about when conditions are too dangerous.
After the break, we'll take a look at the government's proposed landmark changes to protect workers from the heat and what stands in the way from making them happen. We'll be right back.
Anna, I know you've been reporting on proposals from the federal government to protect workers. What's happening there, and what agency is looking into this?
So this is coming out of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and they are looking at finalizing this in 2026. There would be a trigger initially at 80 degrees. That's a heat index of 80 degrees. So that doesn't mean just when the temperature hits 80. It means when the temperature and the humidity combined hit 80 degrees. And at that point, employers would be required to provide rest breaks as needed, water, and to create plans to acclimatize workers, meaning if you're new to a job or maybe you're returning to a job, you are gradually getting used to working in the hot weather. You're not just, bam, showing up Monday morning working in really hot weather. Then at 90 degrees, there are more requirements that kick in. So they would have to monitor their employees for signs of heat illness. They would have to offer mandatory 15-minute breaks every 2 hours. Those breaks have to be paid, which is super important. And they have to check on employees who are working alone. So if you think of people like delivery drivers, postal carriers, some utility workers who are out in the field by themselves, if they run into trouble, it's possible that nobody will know.
I mean, has anything like this been mandated before?
So we have seen efforts, mostly at the local level, at the city level, from workers to get protections like this put in place. There was an effort in Miami-Dade last year at the county level to get the commissioners to approve workplace heat protections. Mostly, this was driven by farm workers and a lot of workers who are in the massive plant nurseries in that area.
Workers unite in the lobby of the Stephen P. Clark Center, joined by Commissioners Keon McGee and Marlene Bastien and Mayor Daniela Levine Cava, in support of protections for those who work in the sweltering heat.
It is too damn hot not to be able to have water, shade, rest, and protection.
In response to that effort, the Florida legislature came back and passed a law that prevents any city or county from putting heat workplace rules in place. So anybody who wants to try and do this is blocked in Florida.
Okay, wow. So that is what's happening in Florida. What about the rest of the country? Are there states that already protect employees when it comes to working in extreme heat?
There are 5 states currently that have heat safety rules on the books. They include California, Colorado, Oregon, Washington, and Minnesota. They all take different approaches, but many of them have heat triggers where at a certain threshold, employers have to offer more protections to workers. Some have protections for both indoor and outdoor workers. Some focus on the agricultural sector. But basically, we don't have anything like this at the federal level. And in most states where You have a lot of agricultural workers, a lot of construction workers, and very high temperatures. I'm speaking mostly about the Sun Belt and the Southeast. We don't have anything like this on the books.
Oh, wow. And that's where it's, the hottest.
Yes.
So then what is the origin of this federal government proposal? Why is the federal government getting involved now?
Well, the Biden administration came in with a real focus on climate change and labor. And when you put those two issues together, this is a good issue for them. This basically is an attempt to protect millions of workers across the country from a risk that we know is already worse than it used to be and is going to get exponentially worse. So it's forward-looking, but it's also dealing with a very real problem that a lot of working class people experience today.
And what do we know about the potential impact of this proposal should it be enacted?
The federal government is estimating that it could affect about 36 million workers across the U.S. When we looked at this just for agricultural workers and construction workers, we found that it would likely protect more than 500,000 agricultural workers and roughly 4.3 million construction workers. And those are in states where you really have the biggest problem, where workers are exposed to at least a month or more of high temperatures.
So what stands in the way of this becoming a finalized rule?
Yeah, there are a lot of obstacles here. The first one is the presidential election. Most labor leaders would tell you and have told us that they believe that the presidential election will decide this issue, that if Trump is elected, that this rule will not be finalized. It will be abandoned. It does not fit with the Republican Party's pro-business, anti-regulatory viewpoint. And this rule is heavily opposed by lots of different business groups, agricultural groups, major construction groups, home builders, tourism groups, advocates for the oil and gas industry, because it has such a broad sweep and affects so many workers across the country. There is a lot of opposition within the business community to this.
Yeah, talk to me about that opposition. What is the crux of that opposition? Or talk me through some of the points that opponents of this rule have made about it.
So you hear very similar arguments from many of these groups. The first and quite common one is employers are already doing these things. These are common sense interventions, and employers have an incentive to keep their workers healthy because production lags if people get sick and have to take breaks because of the heat. And so there is a feeling that employers know best. From there, the arguments are that this is too expensive, that this is burdensome, requires a lot of paperwork and record keeping that these businesses feel they shouldn't have to do. And some of them really feel that the thresholds the federal government is proposing are too low, that in places like Texas and Florida, they could be under these these regulations for, 4 months or more out of the year. They think that's overly burdensome.
And so what do the people who say this is needed, what do they have to say about why we actually do need to have rules like this on the books?
They point to research showing that in temperatures as low as 80 degrees, workers have died from heat illness and heat stroke. So they're saying these numbers might sound low if you're thinking about them purely as temperature thresholds, but when you consider that temperatures are taken in the shade, and we're talking also about humidity here, and then you factor in manual labor, people really working up a sweat at their jobs, then we're talking about a much higher level of heat exposure. And they say that this is a real and present danger and that it is already getting worse. If this rule does become finalized, which they're talking about 2026 as the time frame for this, the other thing to think about is what will happen when it reaches the Supreme Court, which it's virtually guaranteed that Republican attorneys general across the country would file a lawsuit to challenge this. And we have just seen a session of the Supreme Court where they have really diluted the regulatory authority of federal agencies. So what happens to all of the workplace protections that OSHA has put in place over the years and this draft rule under that new ruling.
What's so interesting to me about this as well is, I don't know if you feel this way, Anna, but the feeling that I've had this summer is this heat feels inescapable. Like almost no matter where you go in the continuous United States, it feels like it's just so hot. And is it ever going to not be this hot again? And is this just our new reality? And, you know, you're talking about this proposed rule, which is to mitigate some of that reality. And is this just the new norm that we have to figure out how to get accustomed to?
Yeah, basically. I mean, this is the result of decades of fossil fuel emissions and carbon dioxide building up in our atmosphere. It's not a mystery. And so this is our present reality, and our future reality is hotter. And so rules like this are really being talked about, like you said, as a mitigation strategy. But this is not a preventative. This is not a measure that is going to prevent it from getting hotter down the road. Or we're not even at a point of saying that there's a temperature at which workers shouldn't be working, which is a different conversation entirely. That may be a conversation that starts to take place in the future as we hit even new temperature records.
Thank you, Anna, so much for joining and explaining all of this.
Thanks for having me.
Reporter Anna Phillips spoke to my co-host, Alahe Izadi. Before we go, here's some other news we're following. Last night, Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, claimed victory in yesterday's presidential election. But there are concerns about the legitimacy of the results. Exit polls showed opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez beating Maduro by a wide margin. Maduro has ruled Venezuela since the death of Hugo Chavez in 2013. Many blame Maduro for the country's economic collapse and the exodus of millions of citizens. Gonzalez rejected the official election results. He said, quote, "Our fight continues and we won't rest until the will of the Venezuelan people is respected."
Nuestra lucha continúa y no descansaremos hasta que la voluntad del pueblo de Venezuela sea respetada. Buenas noches.
Many world leaders are also doubting Maduro's win and are calling for transparency. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke this morning from Tokyo.
The international community is watching this very closely and will respond accordingly.
And yesterday morning at the U.S. Botanic Garden in Washington, D.C., the endangered Amorphophallus titanum bloomed.
Yeah. Oh, wow, okay, there it is. Oh, yeah. Oh. Right there.
This is about an 8-foot-tall, alien-looking flower. And every few years, it unleashes a nasty stench that horticulturist Stephen Jones says smells like dirty diapers.
It'll literally make you gag. It's that strong and that awful. Nothing earthy and pleasant about it.
On Sunday, visitors at the Botanic Garden crowded around the flower, getting a whiff.
Are you smelling it at all? What's it smell like to you?
Like it does have a familiar something. Like musky, of some kind of muskiness.
Yep.
Whoa!
That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. And now is a great time to start listening to our pop-up podcast about all things Olympics. It's called The Sports Moment, and it's where our colleagues in Paris are chatting about all the latest wins, losses, and gold medal surprises. You can find it in your podcast app by searching for The Sports Moment. Today's show was produced by Trinity Webster Bass, with support from Alana Gordon. It was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Monica Campbell. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.